October 15, 1946. The corridor outside Cell 5 was silent. Too silent for a prison holding the most powerful surviving Nazis on Earth. The guards had walked that hallway hundreds of times before. They knew every sound. Boots scraping stone, chains shifting, nervous coughing from condemned men waiting for dawn. But that night something was different. Inside the cell sat Hermann Göring, once the second most powerful man in the Third Reich. Head of the Luftwaffe. Hitler's chosen successor. A man who had signed deportation orders with a fountain pen made of gold. By morning he was supposed to hang. The rope had already been tested. The execution list was finalized. The American military guards were ready. And yet, before the hangman could tighten the noose, Göring would be dead. Not by rope. Not by firing squad. But by cyanide. The question that has haunted historians ever since. How did the most heavily guarded prisoner in the world obtain a cyanide capsule? Was it smuggled in? Was it overlooked during searches? Or, as some have whispered for decades, did an American officer quietly help him escape the humiliation of the gallows? Tonight, we go inside the final hours of the Nuremberg prison, where the greatest war criminals awaited judgment, and one of them slipped through history's fingers. The Nuremberg Palace of Justice stood cold and heavy against the October sky. Floodlights illuminated its stone walls. American soldiers stood watch at every entrance. The war was over, but the reckoning had just begun. For nearly a year, the world had watched as Nazi leaders were put on trial for crimes against humanity. The Holocaust, aggressive war, mass murder on an industrial scale. And throughout the trial, Göring had behaved not like a broken man, but like a defiant one. He cross-examined witnesses. He challenged prosecutors. He tried to outwit the court. At times he almost succeeded. Unlike others who looked defeated, Göring appeared composed, even arrogant. Observers noted how he dominated conversations during recess. He joked. He boasted. He acted as though he still commanded a nation. But on October 1, 1946, the verdict came. Death by hanging. Not death by firing squad, which Göring had demanded as a military officer. Hanging. The method reserved for common criminals. To Göring this was not just execution. It was humiliation. And humiliation he could not accept. American guards rotated in strict shifts. Prisoners were searched daily, sometimes multiple times. Cells were inspected. Clothing was examined. Even toothpaste tubes were squeezed open. Cyanide was known to be a risk. Several Nazi officials had used it during the collapse of Berlin. Hitler himself had bitten down on a capsule in April 1945. The Americans were determined that this would not happen again. Göring was stripped of belts, suspenders, sharp objects, anything that could be used for suicide. So how did he do it? That night, at approximately 10:45 p.m., a guard conducting routine checks noticed Göring lying on his cot. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. But seconds later, the prisoner convulsed violently. A doctor was called. Attempts were made. But within minutes, Hermann Göring was dead. The capsule had shattered between his teeth. The rope prepared for him would never be used. When the announcement was made, shock rippled through the prison. Some officers were furious. Others embarrassed. How had this happened under American supervision? And then the rumors began. Some said Göring had hidden the capsule since the moment of his capture in 1945. Others believed it had been concealed in a hollowed-out pen. But a darker possibility circulated quietly among the ranks. What if someone helped him? What if an American officer, perhaps sympathetic, perhaps manipulated, perhaps bribed, had allowed Göring to obtain the poison? There was one name that repeatedly surfaced in whispers. A young U.S. Army lieutenant responsible for overseeing certain aspects of prisoner supervision. He had spoken with Göring often. Too often, some said. Witnesses described Göring as charming when he wanted to be. He could flatter. He could intimidate. He could play psychological games better than almost anyone. Was it possible that even in defeat, he managed to orchestrate his final act? The official investigation began immediately. Cells were searched again. Guards were interrogated. Every officer on duty that night was questioned. The American command needed answers, not only for justice but for reputation. The world was watching. The Soviet delegation was furious. They suspected American incompetence, or worse. If the United States had allowed the most prominent Nazi leader to cheat the hangman, it would be an international embarrassment. But the deeper investigators looked, the stranger the story became. Some guards insisted Göring had been thoroughly searched. Others admitted the procedures weren't always perfect. There were small inconsistencies, tiny gaps. moments where supervision may have relaxed. And one final unsettling detail. Days before his execution, Göring had confidently told fellow prisoners that he would not hang. How could he have known? The first theory, Göring had hidden the cyanide capsule since his capture in May 1945. When American forces arrested him, he was found carrying multiple capsules. Most were confiscated. But did he manage to keep one hidden in clothing seams? In luggage? Inside a hollowed object that went unnoticed? Search records show items were catalogued. But chaos followed Germany's surrender. Paperwork was not always perfect. Could a single capsule have slipped through the cracks for over a year? Possible. But unlikely. Because Göring had been transferred between facilities, searched repeatedly, examined medically, stripped and redressed multiple times. A fragile glass capsule surviving all that? A strange belief. The second theory, someone inside Nuremberg smuggled it in. This is where suspicion darkens. There were American soldiers sympathetic to anti-communist sentiments. Some saw the coming Cold War already forming. To them, the Soviets were the next enemy, not the defeated Nazis. Could an officer have believed that allowing Göring to avoid the gallows would preserve some twisted sense of military honor? Or was it something more personal? Göring had charisma. Even in captivity. He flattered American officers. He spoke English. He discussed aviation. He presented himself as a soldier rather than a butcher. Some guards reportedly enjoyed conversations with him. Was that enough? But here's what makes the story explosive. Decades later, a former U.S. Army officer would claim, indirectly, that he had provided Göring with the cyanide capsule. The claim emerged years after the executions. He suggested Göring had convinced him that hanging would be disgraceful. He implied that he allowed the capsule to reach him. The admission was vague, controversial, never fully proven. But it reignited the question. Did an American officer help Hermann Göring escape the noose? Or was this just another myth born from the shadows of Nuremberg? In the hours after Göring's death, preparations continued. The remaining condemned Nazis were executed one by one. The rope tightened. The trapdoor opened. Justice delayed but delivered. But Göring, the architect, the mastermind, the public face of Hitler's regime, denied the court its final moment. He chose his own end. Or did someone choose it for him? When Hermann Göring died at 10:45 p.m. on October 15, 1946, the silence that followed inside the Palace of Justice was not relief. It was panic. American guards froze. Officers were summoned. Doctors rushed into the cell. Within minutes, word spread through the prison corridors. Göring had beaten the hangman. The execution scheduled for dawn would never happen. The first order came swiftly: seal everything. The cell was locked down. Every object inside was catalogued. His bedding, his clothing, his wash basin, even the mortar between bricks was examined. Military police stood guard as investigators searched for one thing: the source of the cyanide. They found fragments of glass in his mouth. The bitter almond scent lingered in the air. A cyanide capsule had shattered between his teeth, the same method used by Adolf Hitler months earlier in Berlin. But how had it reached him? The security was supposed to be impossible. Nuremberg was not an ordinary prison. It was a fortress. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Göring had been captured by American forces in Bavaria. At the time of his arrest, he possessed multiple cyanide capsules. These were confiscated immediately. American intelligence officers knew the Nazis' preference for suicide. From that moment on, Göring was under extreme supervision. When he arrived at the Nuremberg prison, his routine became mechanical. Strip search. Cell inspection. Guard posted outside 24/7. Lights on during sleeping hours. Random night checks. No private possessions without inspection. Even his toiletries were controlled. His toothpaste was issued in small amounts. His clothing had no hidden linings. His bed frame was inspected regularly. And yet, despite all this, he had swallowed poison on the eve of execution. Someone had failed. Or someone had helped. Immediate suspicions. The U.S. command feared two outcomes: international embarrassment. Soviet accusations of American complicity. The Soviet delegation had demanded strict justice. They had lost millions during the war. To them, Göring's death by suicide looked like an escape from public accountability. If the Americans had allowed it, even accidentally, it would damage their credibility in front of the world. So the investigation turned inward. Every guard on duty was questioned. Every officer in contact with Göring was examined. Shift logs were reviewed, search procedures analyzed, conversations scrutinized. One detail immediately stood out. In the days leading up to his execution, Göring had displayed remarkable calm. He ate well. He joked. He reportedly told another prisoner that he would not hang like a common criminal. That confidence unsettled investigators. Was it bravado? Or knowledge? Göring's psychological game. Throughout the trial at the Nuremberg Palace of Justice, Göring had dominated the courtroom. He cross-examined prosecutors. He challenged witnesses. He spoke as if he were still Reichsmarshal of Germany. At times, he even impressed observers with his composure. American psychologist Dr. Gustav Gilbert, who had access to the prisoners, noted Göring's extraordinary self-control and intelligence. He described him as manipulative, theatrical, and fiercely proud. Göring understood something crucial. The trial was not only about justice, it was about history. And he refused to let the Allies script his final act. Hanging, to him, meant degradation. He had demanded to be shot as a soldier. The tribunal refused. The rope would symbolize criminality. Cyanide would symbolize defiance. The method mattered, and he was determined to choose it. The first theory, the hidden capsule. The simplest explanation was that Göring had hidden a capsule since capture. When arrested in 1945, several cyanide capsules were found among his belongings. Intelligence reports confirmed this. But could he have concealed one more? Investigators revisited the original arrest records. The capsules confiscated were documented. But wartime record-keeping was imperfect. In the chaos of surrender, errors were possible. Still, the theory had problems. Göring had been transferred multiple times between facilities. Each transfer involved full strip searches, medical examinations, clothing changes, inventory of possessions. The cyanide capsules used by Nazis were small glass ampoules, fragile, difficult to conceal for over a year without breaking. Could he have hidden one inside his body? Some speculated about rectal concealment. But medical inspections during imprisonment make that unlikely over such a long period. The more investigators examined this theory, the weaker it appeared. It required luck beyond reason. And Göring was many things, but he did not rely on luck. The second theory, inside assistance. This is where the case becomes unsettling. If Göring did not preserve a capsule from 1945, then someone must have given him one. The prison staff consisted primarily of American military personnel. Young officers. Guards rotated in shifts. Some were veterans hardened by war. Others were barely out of training. Göring had a unique strategy with them. He befriended them. He spoke English fluently. He discussed aviation and military strategy. He presented himself not as a genocidal architect, but as a professional soldier. Some guards later admitted they found him intelligent and even charismatic. That charisma could be dangerous. One officer in particular had frequent interactions with Göring. His name would later surface in historical debate, Jack G. Wheelis. Wheelis was responsible for supervising certain prisoner routines. Years later he would make a startling claim. But in 1946 he denied any wrongdoing. Investigators questioned him carefully. Did he conduct proper searches? Did he ever pass unsupervised items? Did he ever speak privately with Göring? Wheelis insisted procedures were followed. No evidence at the time directly implicated him. But suspicion lingered. Shortly before his death, Göring wrote a letter. In it, he claimed he had possessed the cyanide capsule since his capture. He suggested he had hidden it successfully for over a year. The letter was convenient. Almost too convenient. By claiming long-term concealment, he removed blame from the Americans. He preserved his own image as clever and resourceful. But investigators wondered, was this final statement yet another manipulation? If an American officer had helped him, Göring might protect that person, either out of gratitude or as part of a final psychological move. After all, what greater final victory than leaving doubt behind? The night itself. Witness testimony from that final evening adds more complexity. Göring had eaten dinner normally. He appeared relaxed. A guard performed the standard 10 p.m. check. Nothing unusual. But between that check and the next he bit down on the capsule. The timing suggests deliberation. He chose the moment carefully, late enough to avoid immediate interruption, but early enough to ensure he would not be discovered alive and saved. Cyanide works quickly. Within seconds, respiratory collapse begins. Medical response would have been futile. He knew that. International reaction. The news broke quickly. Headlines across the world reported that Göring had cheated the gallows. In Moscow, suspicion hardened. Soviet officials questioned American competence. Some privately suggested intentional leniency. In Washington, embarrassment spread through military leadership. The United States had overseen the largest war crimes trial in history, and its most famous defendant had escaped the rope. That stain could not be ignored. But then, decades later, years passed. The executions faded into history. But in the 1960s and 1970s, rumors resurfaced. Former officers began giving interviews. Memoirs were published. And in one account, Jack G. Wheelis implied he had smuggled the cyanide capsule to Göring. He suggested Göring had hidden it in a pen. He hinted at sympathy for allowing him to avoid the humiliation of hanging. The statement was controversial. Some historians believe Wheelis exaggerated. Others believe he told the truth too late to face consequences. There was no physical evidence left to prove it either way. Confession, contradictions, and the pen that changed history. The official record closed the case quickly. The U.S. Army concluded that Hermann Göring had hidden the cyanide capsule since his capture in 1945. His final letter supported that claim. No American officer was formally charged. No court-martial followed. On paper, the mystery was solved. In reality, it was just beginning. The problem with the hidden since capture story. To believe Göring kept a cyanide capsule for over a year, investigators had to accept several unlikely events. That he evaded repeated strip searches. That he preserved a fragile glass ampoule through multiple transfers. That medical inspections never detected it. That prison searches inside the Nuremberg Palace of Justice missed it for months. Göring had been searched upon arrest. Cyanide capsules were found and confiscated. American intelligence officers were already aware of Nazi suicide culture. They were cautious. Later, at Nuremberg, security tightened even further. Guards documented personal items. Cells were inspected daily. Prisoners were monitored around the clock. If Göring truly concealed the capsule that entire time, it required almost superhuman luck. Or something else. The pen theory. Decades later, a new version emerged. The story involved a pen. According to later claims attributed to Jack G. Wheelis, Göring may have hidden the cyanide capsule inside a hollowed-out fountain pen. The idea was simple. A pen, unlike clothing or bedding, might not attract suspicion. If it appeared ordinary and functional, it could pass casual inspection. Inside, a small glass capsule could remain protected from breakage. Wheelis allegedly suggested that Göring had managed to keep such a pen during his imprisonment, and that its contents were not fully examined. But here's where historians divide. Some argue this explanation is plausible. A hollow pen could conceal a capsule effectively. Searches, though frequent, may not have involved dismantling every writing instrument piece by piece. Others argue that high-profile prisoners like Göring were subjected to extremely thorough inspections. It is difficult to imagine guards overlooking such an obvious risk item. Still, the pen theory refuses to die. Wheelis's later admission. Years after the executions, Jack Wheelis reportedly made statements implying involvement. In certain interviews and accounts, he suggested that Göring had requested assistance in avoiding the humiliation of hanging. Wheelis allegedly claimed that he allowed the cyanide capsule to reach him, though the exact mechanism remained unclear. But here's the crucial detail. No official confession under oath was ever made. No court examined this claim. No contemporaneous evidence confirmed it. By the time these remarks surfaced, decades had passed. Memories fade. Narratives shift. Some historians believe Wheelis exaggerated his role, perhaps seeking attention, perhaps reshaping memory. Others believe he was revealing a guarded secret too late to matter. The absence of hard documentation keeps the case suspended between history and legend. Motive? Why would an American officer help? This is the most controversial question. Why would a U.S. Army officer assist a convicted Nazi war criminal? Several possible motives have been suggested. 1. Sympathy for military honor. Göring constantly portrayed himself as a soldier rather than a criminal. He emphasized his World War I hero status. He insisted that hanging was inappropriate for a military officer. Some American officers, themselves soldiers, may have understood that argument emotionally, even if they rejected it legally. Allowing him cyanide could be seen as preserving soldiers' dignity. But this remains speculative. 2. Manipulation. Göring was extraordinarily persuasive. Psychologists who studied him during the trial described him as dominant, strategic, and charismatic. He read people quickly. He knew how to flatter. If he convinced an officer that the Allies were dishonoring themselves by hanging him, he might have exploited that sentiment. In this view, any assistance would not be ideological, but psychological. 3. Embarrassing security failure. There is another possibility. Perhaps no one intentionally helped him. Perhaps security was imperfect. Perhaps a guard overlooked something small. In that case, later stories about assistance might serve as distraction, shifting attention away from simple negligence. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the least dramatic. But the dramatic explanation is the one that survives. The final hours revisited. Eyewitness testimony from that night remains consistent in one way. Göring did not appear desperate. He appeared confident. That confidence is difficult to explain unless he knew something others did not. Earlier that day he reportedly joked about avoiding the hangman. Such comments suggest preparation. Cyanide capsules are not improvised tools. They must be obtained deliberately. And timing is everything. He waited until after the final checks. He chose a moment with minimal interruption risk. He ensured death would come swiftly. This was not panic. It was strategy. The Soviet suspicion. The Soviet delegation never fully accepted the American explanation. They had demanded strict justice for Nazi crimes, especially given the immense suffering inflicted on the Eastern Front. To them, Göring's suicide looked suspicious. In the emerging tension between the Allies, what would soon become the Cold War, even small incidents gained political weight. Although no formal accusation was sustained, mistrust lingered. The Americans insisted it was suicide. The Soviets questioned how such a failure could occur. In the shadows of 1946, the alliance that defeated Hitler was already fracturing. The executions that followed. Despite Göring's death, the executions proceeded. Other condemned leaders were hanged as scheduled. The rope that Göring avoided tightened around the necks of others. Justice in the Allies' view had been served, even if imperfectly. But symbolically something was lost. The public hanging of Göring would have been the ultimate image of accountability. Instead he controlled his final moment. He denied the tribunal its spectacle. And that denial fuels suspicion to this day. What most historians conclude. The majority of mainstream historians lean toward one of two conclusions. Göring managed to conceal the capsule through extraordinary cunning. Security oversight allowed him access without intentional assistance. Direct proof of deliberate American help remains absent. Willis's later remarks are intriguing, but not conclusive. No documentation from 1946 supports a conspiracy. No physical evidence survived to validate the Penn story. In historical methodology, absence of evidence is not proof of innocence, but it also cannot confirm guilt. Thus the case remains unresolved. The psychological victory. Whether aided or not, Göring achieved something significant. He dictated the terms of his own death. He avoided the humiliation he feared most. And he left behind a question mark that still generates debate. For a man obsessed with control and image, that final act may have been his last assertion of power. He stood trial. He was condemned. But he was not hanged. The mystery is not just about cyanide. It is about control, pride, manipulation, and whether justice can truly be complete when the condemned chooses his own ending. At 1:11 a.m. on October 16, 1946, the executions resumed inside the Nuremberg Palace of Justice. One by one, condemned Nazi leaders were led to the gallows. They climbed 13 wooden steps. They stood beneath a black hood. The trapdoor opened. Justice, at least in physical form, was carried out. But one rope hung unused. It had been measured for Hermann Göring. It would never tighten. And that empty rope became a symbol, not of mercy but of unfinished finality. Did justice fail? On paper, no. Göring was tried in the first International War Crimes Tribunal in history. He was found guilty of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death. He did not escape judgment. He escaped spectacle. That distinction matters. Because justice operates in two dimensions. Legal accountability. Public closure. Legally, Göring's guilt was established beyond doubt. The record of the trial is massive, detailed, and damning. The world heard evidence of deportations, plunder, forced labor, and mass murder. But emotionally, symbolically, something felt incomplete. The image of the once powerful Reichsmarshal standing beneath a hangman's rope would have carried historic weight. It would have visually closed a chapter. Instead, he bit down on glass and died on his own terms. To many, that felt like defiance. Control until the end. Throughout the trial, Göring had attempted to control the narrative. He cross-examined witnesses. He sparred with prosecutors. He projected authority. He attempted to present himself as a statesman rather than a criminal architect. When the tribunal rejected his request to be shot as a soldier, hanging him like a civilian felon, it struck at his identity. Cyanide was not just a method of death. It was an act of resistance against humiliation. Whether he hid the capsule for over a year or received assistance from someone like Jack G. Wheelis, the result was the same. He chose the moment. He chose the method. He denied the Allies the final image. For a man obsessed with legacy, that mattered. The Cold War shadow. The unanswered questions surrounding his suicide did not fade, they hardened. By 1947, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union had escalated dramatically. Suspicion defined diplomacy. In that climate, even minor irregularities became politically charged. If an American officer had helped Göring, it would have been a scandal. If security had simply failed, it would have been an embarrassment. If Göring had truly outsmarted his captors for over a year, it would have been an extraordinary feat. None of these possibilities were comfortable. So the official narrative settled quickly. He had hidden the capsule. Case closed. But history rarely closes so neatly. The human factor. Prisons are run by people. Trials are conducted by people. Security is enforced by people. And people are imperfect. Could a guard have been manipulated? Possibly. Could an officer have felt a strange professional sympathy toward a defeated military commander? It's uncomfortable, but human psychology is complicated. Göring was charismatic, intelligent, confident. He knew how to project strength even in chains. Some guards reportedly found him fascinating. Not admirable, but compelling. And in confined spaces, prolonged exposure can distort perception. History shows that powerful personalities often influence their captors more than expected. That does not prove assistance, but it makes the possibility believable. The absence of proof. The strongest argument against deliberate help is simple. There is no solid evidence. No signed confession under oath. No documented transfer of poison. No contemporaneous witness testimony confirming assistance. Wheelis's later remarks remain controversial and ambiguous. Memory decades after an event is not the same as evidence recorded during it. Professional historians rely on documentation. And documentation is thin. That leaves the case suspended between probability and possibility. Why the mystery endures. If Göring had been hanged like the others, this question would not exist. His death by cyanide created narrative tension. Humans are drawn to unresolved endings. We want clarity. We want certainty. We want to know whether justice was undermined by error, manipulation, or quiet complicity. But history does not always provide closure. Sometimes it leaves echoes. And Göring's suicide is one of those echoes. The larger meaning. In the broader arc of history, his method of death does not erase his crimes. The Holocaust remains documented. The war remains recorded. The verdict remains written. The tribunal established a precedent that leaders could be held personally accountable for atrocities. That legacy stands far larger than one capsule of poison. But symbolism matters. Images matter. And the absence of Göring at the gallows became part of the story. He was present at the trial. Present at sentencing. Absent at execution. That absence still invites speculation. Consider this. If an American officer had truly wanted to protect Göring, he could have done far more than smuggle cyanide. He could have sabotaged evidence. He could have influenced testimony. He could have interfered with the verdict itself. None of that happened. The trial proceeded openly. The sentence was delivered. The world witnessed accountability. The suicide then may not represent Allied failure, but Göring's final illusion of control. In death, he could pretend he had outmaneuvered his captors. In reality, he had already been judged. History remembers him not as a defiant soldier, but as a convicted war criminal who swallowed poison to avoid a rope. That distinction matters. So, did an American officer help? The honest answer is this. There is no definitive proof. There are intriguing claims. There are inconsistencies. There are psychological possibilities. But there is no smoking gun. Most evidence suggests either extraordinary concealment or security oversight, not confirmed conspiracy. The mystery survives because certainty does not. In the quiet hours after the executions, the bodies were cremated. Ashes were scattered to prevent graves from becoming shrines. No monument marks Göring's death. No grave bears his name. Only trial transcripts. Only archives. Only debate. And somewhere in those records the image remains. A glass capsule. A shattered ampoule. A rope unused. History rarely ends the way we expect. Sometimes justice is loud, the snap of a trapdoor. Sometimes it is silent, the crack of glass between teeth. Either way, the verdict remains. And the question lingers, not because it changes what he did, but because it reminds us that even in the most controlled courtroom in the world, uncertainty can survive.